There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man when his own child looks at him like he's an embarrassment. It doesn't announce itself. It just moves in, sits down at your table, and stays. I want to tell you about the night my daughter called me a broke old soldier in front of 40 of her husband's colleagues, and how I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't asked for, and said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, because I had everything to say, and saying it right then would have cost me something I wasn't willing to spend. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 68 years old, and for 11 years I sat on the board of a private holding company that, among other things, owned 81% of the firm my son-in-law worked for. He didn't know that. My daughter didn't know that. Nobody at that party knew that the man in the ill-fitting blazer, the one they'd sat at the table nobody wanted, next to the bar nobody used, was the reason half of them still had jobs. This is the story of how I found out exactly what my daughter thought of me, and what it cost her to find out what I actually was. I lived then, as I live now, in a 2-bedroom rental on the north side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, on a quiet street called Red Bank Lane where the houses were built in the 60s and the trees had finally gotten tall enough to matter. I drove a 2011 Ford Ranger with 190,000 miles on it. I ate breakfast most mornings at a diner called Dots, 2 stools down from a retired lineman named Curtis who talked more than anyone I'd ever met and somehow never bored me. I had been, on paper, a logistics consultant. That's what my daughter told people. It sounded modest and vague, which suited me fine. In truth, I still did 2 hours of work most mornings before Curtis and I ever got to talking. A call here, a document there, a signature on something that moved more money in a sentence than most people move in a lifetime. I never talked about it. Not out of shame. Out of habit. 31 years in the Army teaches you that the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one, and I had spent my whole life trying to be the second kind. My wife, Loretta, had passed 6 years earlier. My daughter, Renata, was 34, married to a man named Preston Vance, and living in a gated development outside Nashville that Preston liked to describe, unprompted, as up and coming, as though the neighborhood needed a press release. Preston was a regional director at a firm called Hallcrest Logistics Group. He was proud of that title. He said it the way other men say surgeon. I had a dog, a graying beagle mix named Sarge, who slept on the foot of my bed and greeted every knock at the door like it might be the mailman bringing him a medal. Sarge and Curtis were, at that point in my life, roughly half of my active social calendar. The other half was Renata, when she called, which by then had become an occasion rather than a habit. I didn't mind the quiet life. I want to be honest about that before I tell you what happened next. I wasn't sitting in that rental house nursing a grudge, waiting for my moment. I liked my coffee. I liked my dog. I liked the sound of Curtis complaining about the Thunder's bullpen even though the Thunder don't have a bullpen. They're a basketball team, and he knew that, and I knew that, and we let it go every single time because correcting him would have ended a bit we both enjoyed. My routine had a shape to it, the way a life does after enough years of practice. Up at 5:30, coffee on the porch while Sarge did his slow circuit of the yard, sniffing at the same 3 fence posts he'd sniffed the morning before, like the news might have changed overnight. Calls and correspondence from 6 to 8, done at the kitchen table with the radio low. Dots by 8:15, eggs over medium, wheat toast, Curtis already 2 stools down complaining about something that hadn't happened yet. Afternoons I kept mostly for myself. I read, I fixed things around the house that didn't strictly need fixing. I drove out to the lake sometimes just to sit and watch other people fish. It was not, by any measure, an exciting life. But it was mine, built by my own hands out of 31 years of discipline and 6 years of learning how to be alone without being lonely, and I was, for the most part, at peace inside it. I just didn't know yet how small my daughter had decided I was. The first time I felt it, really felt it, was at Thanksgiving, 11 months before the party. Renata and Preston hosted that year at the house outside Nashville. I drove the 6 hours because I don't fly if I can help it. Old habit from a different kind of travel. And I brought a pecan pie I'd made myself, from Loretta's recipe, the one with the extra teaspoon of bourbon that always made people ask twice before finishing their slice. Preston opened the door, looked at the pie, and said, "Oh, homemade. That's sweet, Walt. Not unkind, exactly. Just the tone you'd use on a child who'd drawn you a picture." He set it on the far end of the counter, behind the store-bought pumpkin one from a bakery in Franklin, and it stayed there, mostly untouched, for the rest of the night. At dinner, Renata's mother-in-law, a bright, brittle woman named Carol, asked me what I did for work, and before I could answer, Renata jumped in. Dad's retired military, sort of does some part-time consulting now, she said, already turning to pass the rolls. Nothing exciting. Sort of. Nothing exciting. Two small words, dropped like nothing, and I felt them land somewhere behind my sternum. I let it go. I told myself she just didn't know how to explain what I did, because I'd never fully explained it to her either. That was on me, I thought, not on her. The second time was Christmas, 4 months later, back in Tulsa this time. Though hosting wasn't quite the word for it, Renata and Preston flew in for 2 nights and stayed at a hotel instead of my house, which had never happened before. Preston said something about the flight schedule. I didn't push. We exchanged gifts in my living room, the 3 of us and Sarge underfoot. I'd bought Preston a hand-tooled leather wallet, the kind of thing that lasts 20 years if you take care of it. He opened it, turned it over once, and said, "Wow, thanks, Walt. I'll definitely use this for something. For something. Not I'll carry this. For something." Like a wallet was a strange enough object that its use needed to be decided later, at leisure, possibly never. Renata laughed, not cruelly, but easily, the way you laugh at a joke that's already been made a dozen times in rooms you weren't in. "Dad's gifts are always so practical," she said, and Preston smiled at that like it confirmed something they discussed in the car. I nodded and said it was good to see them and refilled everyone's eggnog. Sarge put his head on my knee, and I scratched his ears, and I told myself that 34-year-olds sometimes forget how to be gentle with their fathers, the way children forget how to be gentle with anything they've stopped being afraid of losing. The third time was sharper. It was May, at a graduation party for Preston's nephew, a big backyard affair with a rented tent and a bartender in a vest. I wasn't going to go. It wasn't my family, not really, but Renata asked me to come, and some part of me, the part that still hoped these invitations meant something, said yes. I stood near the drink table for most of the evening because I didn't know anyone and nobody seemed inclined to fix that. At one point I overheard Renata, maybe 20 feet away, talking to a woman I didn't recognize, gesturing faintly in my direction. "That's my dad. He's a widower, lives alone in Oklahoma. Retired Army, does a little consulting to keep busy. It's fine, he likes his routine. It's fine. He likes his routine," said with the particular gentleness people reserve for describing something a little sad, a little smaller than it used to be. I didn't correct her. I finished my drink and found Preston's father, a decent man named Roy, and talked with him about fly fishing for 45 minutes, and that was the best part of my night, and nobody in that backyard would have guessed it. The fourth time, the one that finally cracked something loose in me, came 2 months later, in July, at what Renata called a networking mixer at their country club, a fundraiser for one of Preston's professional associations, black tie optional, 40-some guests, most of them people from Hallcrest Logistics Group and its partner firms. Renata had asked me to come specifically. "It'll mean a lot to Preston," she'd said on the phone, and I'd driven the 6 hours again, brought a decent gray suit I hadn't worn since Loretta's funeral, and shown up ready to be, for one evening, simply somebody's father-in-law. They sat me at a table near the service entrance, next to the bar station nobody used because the real bar was on the other side of the room. Renata came by once, early, introduced me to nobody, and drifted back toward the crowd around Preston, who was holding court near the dessert table about a supply chain contract he'd apparently just closed. I sat there for the better part of an hour, nursing a sparkling water, watching my daughter shine in a room full of strangers who I now understood, quietly, better than she did. Then Carol and Preston's mother, the same bright, brittle woman from Thanksgiving, came over with a younger couple in tow and asked Renata, loud enough for the table to hear, "Now who's this? Is this your father?" And Renata, laughing, a little wine-warm, a little performing for the crowd around her husband, said the thing that finally landed all the way through. "Oh yeah, that's my dad. Don't mind him. He's just my broke old soldier. Doesn't get out much. Broke old soldier." The table laughed. Not viciously, just easily, the way people laugh at a line that's clearly been rehearsed in some other conversation, polished for exactly this kind of room. I smiled. I actually smiled, Because 31 years of service teaches you how to hold your face steady when your chest is doing something else entirely. I said, guilty as charged, and I raised my water glass half an inch, and the moment passed, and the party moved on around me like a river moves around a stone. I want to be clear about something. It wasn't the word broke that did it, though the word was inaccurate in ways she couldn't have imagined. It wasn't even old, though 68 isn't old, not really, not to me. It was the tone. It was the ease of it. It was the fact that she had clearly said some version of this before, to other people, in other rooms, and I was only now hearing the version meant for my face. I finished my sparkling water. I said my goodbyes early, told Renata I had a long drive, and she barely looked up from the circle of people around her husband. Drive safe, Dad, she said, already turning back. I drove 2 hours that night before I stopped at a motel outside Clarksville, because I didn't trust myself, not with rage, but with something heavier. The specific exhaustion of being unseen by the one person you'd have died for 100 times over, gladly, without a second's hesitation. The catalyst came 3 weeks later, and it didn't come from a party. It came from a phone call at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. I was asleep. Sarge woke me, growling low at nothing, the way old dogs do sometimes at sounds only they can hear. My phone was already ringing. It was Renata, and her voice was wrong. Thin and fast in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was 19, and calling from a police station after a car accident that wasn't her fault, but it scared her half to death anyway. Dad, I need Preston's job. There's an investigation. They froze the accounts. I don't. Dad, I don't know what's happening. I don't know who else to call. I sat up. Sarge put his chin on my knee. Slow down, I said. Tell me exactly what you know. It came out in pieces. Hallcrest Logistics Group, the firm Preston worked for, the firm I, in fact, held a controlling stake in through the holding company I sat on the board of, had flagged irregularities in a set of regional contracts Preston's division managed. Compliance had frozen department spending pending a review. Preston was, as of that evening, on administrative leave and terrified, and Renata was standing in their kitchen at midnight with their 8-year-old daughter, my granddaughter Etta, awake and crying in the doorway because she'd heard her parents arguing about money in a way she'd never heard before. Can you help? Renata asked, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard in 14 months, not once, not at Thanksgiving or Christmas or the party where she'd called me a broke old soldier. She sounded, for the first time in a long time, like she actually needed her father. And then, in the background, small and clear and utterly without malice, I heard Etta's voice. Mommy, is Papa Walt going to fix it? Preston said Papa Walt doesn't have any money to fix things. 8 years old. No agenda. No cruelty. Just a child repeating, verbatim, what she'd overheard the adults in her house saying about her grandfather, and asking, with total faith, whether the broke old soldier was going to come save them anyway. I sat with that question a long moment before I answered anyone. I'll look into it, I told Renata. Get some sleep. Keep it close. I hung up, and I sat in the dark of my bedroom in Tulsa, Sarge's head warm against my leg, and I thought about a great many things. About Loretta, about 31 years of choosing quiet competence over loud credit, about a granddaughter who thought her grandfather couldn't fix things because that's what she'd been told, in her own kitchen, by people who should have known better. I did not raise my voice. I did not call Renata back and demand an apology, or a reckoning, or an accounting of every small cruelty I'd swallowed over the past 14 months. That's not how I was built, and it's not how I choose to move through the world, not even when the moving would be justified. There is a kind of strength that shows itself loud, that slams doors, that raises its voice until the walls remember it. And there is a kind that shows itself by doing the work in silence and letting the results speak instead. I have never believed the first kind was stronger. I've buried too many loud men to believe that. The quiet ones are usually the ones still standing when it matters. I called my company's general counsel at 6 the next morning. Here is what my daughter did not know, and what I had never told her, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because I had never once needed her to know it in order to feel whole. After I left the Army in my late 40s, I didn't retire in any ordinary sense. I went into logistics consulting the way some men go into gardening, quietly, patiently, because I understood systems, and supply chains are systems, and systems are things I had spent 3 decades learning to move without breaking. Within 6 years, I'd built a small advisory practice into a stake in a regional freight consolidation firm. Within 11, that firm had merged twice, restructured once, and become part of a holding group, Ashworth Meridian Partners, where I sat on the board and held, through a trust set up after Loretta's passing, a controlling interest in 3 of its portfolio companies. One of those companies was Hallcrest Logistics Group. I hadn't engineered Preston's job there. That part was coincidence, or maybe not entirely. Preston had been hired 2 years before he ever met Renata, at a firm I already had a stake in, long before I knew either of their names would ever be tangled up with mine. I'd simply never mentioned it, because it had never once come up in a way that mattered, and because I've never believed in leading with my resume at a family dinner. In the basement of my rental house on Red Bank Lane, in a locked filing cabinet next to a shelf of Loretta's old cookbooks, I kept a banker's box of records, board minutes, audit trails, correspondence with our compliance team going back 4 years, and a flash drive containing the full financial history of every regional division under Hallcrest's umbrella, including the one Preston ran. I hadn't kept that box out of suspicion of my son-in-law. I kept it because that's simply what 30 years of quiet diligence looks like. You keep the paper trail, you know the numbers cold, you don't wait for a crisis to understand your own house. That Tuesday night's crisis, it turned out, was exactly the kind of thing that box existed for. I called Ashworth Meridian's general counsel, a sharp, unhurried woman named Denise Okafor, at 6 the next morning, and I asked her to pull everything compliance had on Hallcrest's regional contracts, specifically the ones under Preston's division. By 9, I had it in front of me on my kitchen table, Sarge asleep under my chair, coffee going cold at my elbow. It took me 4 hours to understand what compliance had already half suspected. The irregularities weren't Preston's doing. They belonged to a subordinate of his, a contracts manager named Grant Wexler, who'd been quietly steering a percentage of vendor invoices through a shell entity registered to his brother-in-law for the better part of 18 months. Preston had signed off on the invoices, that was true, and it was a real failure of oversight, the kind that costs a man his job in most well-run companies. But he hadn't built the scheme, and he hadn't profited from it. He'd been careless. He hadn't been crooked. There's a difference, and it's a difference that matters enormously if you're the one deciding a man's future. I didn't call Renata that day. I didn't call Preston. I let Denise and the internal audit team do their work properly, methodically, the way it's supposed to be done, without a family member leaning on the scale. 3 days later, I drove to Nashville. I didn't go to the house first. I went to Hallcrest's corporate office, on the 11th floor of a glass building off West End Avenue, and I asked the front desk to connect me with the head of internal audit, a formal, careful man named Desmond Ruiz, whom I'd worked with twice before on other matters, and who knew exactly whose name was on the trust that owned the majority stake in the company he worked for. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, standing when I walked into his office. "I wasn't expecting you in person. I have a personal interest in this one," I said. "My son-in-law's the division head under review. I want you to walk me through everything, and I want it done exactly the way you'd do it if I weren't in the room." He did. For 2 hours, Desmond laid out the full timeline. The shell entity, the falsified vendor onboarding paperwork, the pattern of invoices that had slipped past Preston's signature because Preston, by every account, trusted Grant Wexler more than the process required and had stopped double-checking line items he should have kept checking. It was negligence. Documented, unglamorous, entirely fixable negligence. Not fraud, not theft, not the kind of thing that ends a career if a company is being led by people willing to separate carelessness from corruption. "What's the recommendation?" I asked. "Termination for Wexler, obviously. That's already moving, legal's involved. For Vance," Desmond paused, glanced at me carefully, the way people do when they're not sure how honest they're allowed to be with the man who owns the building. "Formal reprimand. Mandatory retraining on vendor oversight. 6-month probation on signing authority. If it were anyone else's son-in-law, that's exactly where I'd land." "Then that's where you land," I said. "I'm not here to protect him. I'm here to make sure the process runs clean either way." Desmond nodded slowly, and something in his face eased, like he'd expected me to lean the other direction and was relieved I hadn't. I went to the house that evening. Renata opened the door and looked, for a moment, like she didn't recognize the version of me standing on her porch. Not because I looked different, but because I'd never once shown up like this, with a leather folio under my arm and something settled and certain in my posture that she'd apparently never had cause to notice before. "Dad," she said, Did you find something out? Is Preston going to lose his job? Can I come in?" I asked. I'd like Preston here too. And I think it's all right if Etta hears part of this, honestly. Not the numbers, just the ending. We sat in their living room, the same room where, 6 months earlier, Preston had turned my leather wallet over once and said he'd use it for something. He looked smaller than I remembered, sitting on the edge of the couch with his hands clasped between his knees, the particular posture of a man bracing for a verdict. "I want you both to understand something," I said. "I sit on the board of the company that owns Hallcrest Logistics Group. Have for going on 11 years. I've known that Preston worked there since before you two started dating, Renata. I never mentioned it because I never had reason to. It wasn't a secret I was keeping from you out of shame. It just never came up in a way that mattered, until Tuesday night." The silence that followed was long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on in the kitchen. "You own Hallcrest?" Preston said, finally, his voice cracking somewhere in the middle of the sentence. "Well, it's not quite right. I'm a majority stakeholder through a trust. Point is, I had access to the full audit, and I made sure it was handled by the book. Not softened for you, not hardened against you either. You're not being fired, Preston. Grant Wexler is, for cause, effective this week. You're getting a formal reprimand, a retraining requirement, and 6 months of restricted signing authority. That's the honest outcome. You earned the reprimand by trusting a man you shouldn't have trusted enough to stop checking his work. You also earned the second chance, because what you did wrong was carelessness, not theft." Preston put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it, which I respected more than I expected to. "I don't understand," he said. "You let us think you were just some retired guy doing part-time work. You let Renata say that stuff about you at parties, and you never. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because I don't need a room full of strangers to know what I'm worth in order to know it myself," I said. "That's not a lesson I learned yesterday, Preston. That's 31 years of learning it the hard way, in places where the men who bragged loudest were usually the ones who got other men killed." Renata hadn't said a word. She was sitting very still, her hand pressed flat against her mouth, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out cracked and small in a way I hadn't heard since she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. "Dad, at the mixer, I called you I said you were a broke old soldier." I said, evenly, not unkindly. "I remember. I didn't mean, you did mean it," I said. "Maybe not cruelly, but you meant it, Renata. You'd said some version of it before, in front of people, more than once. I heard the ease in it. That's how I knew it wasn't the first time. I want to tell you I said this with some triumphant heat behind it, the kind you might expect from a man who'd just revealed he was worth more than his son-in-law's entire company would ever pay Preston in a lifetime. I didn't. I said it the way you'd read a weather report. Plainly, because the facts didn't need decoration, and dressing them up would have made the moment about my ego instead of about the truth finally landing where it needed to land. Preston's reaction, by contrast, was loud in the particular quiet way that guilt is loud. He stood up, paced to the window and back, ran both hands through his hair, said "Jesus, Walt, Jesus," 3 or 4 times like the words might rearrange something if repeated enough. It wasn't performance. I don't think he could have performed it if he'd tried. It was just a man discovering, all at once, that he'd spent 2 years being condescending to the person who'd been quietly holding up the floor beneath his feet. Etta wandered in from the hallway partway through, drawn by the noise, and climbed straight into my lap without asking, the way 8-year-olds do when they've decided a room is safe again. "Is Daddy okay?" She asked me directly, ignoring both her parents. "Daddy's okay," I told her. "He made a mistake at work, and he's going to fix it, and everybody's going to be all right." "Preston said you didn't have money to fix things," she said again, quieter this time, like she was checking whether the thing she'd heard was still true. "Well," I said, "turns out I had a little more than Preston knew." She considered that with the total seriousness only a child can bring to an adult problem, then nodded once, satisfied, and asked if Sarge could come visit next time. I told her he'd like that very much. I didn't leave that night thinking everything was fixed. 14 months of small dismissals don't dissolve in one honest conversation, no matter how thorough the honesty is. But something had shifted cleanly and permanently in the way Renata looked at me across that living room. Not fear, and not the performative gratitude I half expected, but something closer to recognition. Like she was seeing, for the first time in years, the actual shape of the man who'd raised her, instead of the outline she'd gotten comfortable filling in with assumptions. The weeks that followed were slower than I expected, and I think that's the honest part of this story, the part these kinds of stories don't always tell you. Preston called me himself, 10 days later, not Renata calling on his behalf. He asked if I'd be willing to walk him through what watching the process properly actually looked like, not as his father-in-law, he said, but as a board member who clearly understood oversight better than he did. I said yes. We spent an hour on the phone that first time, mostly about vendor onboarding controls, and it was, strangely, the first real conversation the two of us had ever had that didn't involve either of us performing for someone else's benefit. Renata's calls changed too, though not overnight, and not in a way I'd call dramatic. She started asking questions instead of narrating. What was the Army actually like, day to day? Not the recruiting poster version. What does a consultant like you actually do all morning? Did you and Mom ever fight about money, back when you didn't have any? Small questions. The kind you only ask someone once you've stopped assuming you already know the answer. In September, 2 months after that living room conversation, she flew out to Tulsa by herself. No Preston, no Etta, just her, and she sat across from me at Dot's Diner, 2 stools down from Curtis, who talked her ear off about the Thunder's bullpen for a solid 15 minutes before Renata finally, gently, told him basketball teams don't have bullpens, and Curtis said he knew that, and I watched my daughter laugh, really laugh. Unguarded, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. She apologized properly that day, not the flustered half apology from the living room, but a real one, over eggs and burnt coffee. I built a version of you in my head that was easier to explain to people, she said. Quiet, harmless, a little sad. It was never fair to you. I think it was easier than admitting I didn't actually know what you did with your days, and I never bothered to find out. I told her I forgave her, and I meant it, but I also told her something I needed her to hear alongside the forgiveness, that I wasn't interested in swinging from being dismissed to being performed for, either. I didn't need to be introduced at parties as some kind of secret tycoon now that the secret was out. I just wanted to be introduced, accurately, as her father. That was the whole ask. It had always been the whole ask. She held that boundary better than I expected. At Preston's company holiday party that December, the same club, the same crowd, some of the very same faces from the mixer where I'd been called a broke old soldier, Renata introduced me differently this time. Not with numbers, not with titles, not with any correction of the record loud enough to draw attention. This is my dad, Walter, she said, to a couple I didn't recognize. Retired Army. Smartest man I know. Nothing more than that. It didn't need anything more than that. There was a small ceremony to it, weeks later, that I still think about more than almost anything else from that year. Loretta's pecan pie recipe, the one Preston had set behind the store-bought pumpkin pie that first Thanksgiving and barely touched. Renata asked me to make it again for the following Thanksgiving, and this time she put it in the center of the table herself, moved the store-bought one to the side, and told Carol unprompted, that it was her mother's recipe and her father's hands, and that people ought to try it before they filled up on anything else. It was a small thing. A pie moved 6 inches across a table, but I understood exactly what she meant by it, and I think, by then, so did everyone else at that table. There were setbacks in between, and I don't want to pretend otherwise, because I think the setbacks are the part people leave out when they tell these stories, and leaving them out does a disservice to anyone actually living through something similar. In October, Renata mentioned offhand on the phone that she'd told a coworker I was helping out with some business stuff for Preston's company, which still wasn't the truth, still flattened 11 years of board membership into something small enough to fit in a sentence she felt comfortable saying out loud. I told her, gently, that I'd noticed. She got quiet, then admitted she wasn't used to explaining me accurately yet, that the old shorthand still came out first, before she caught herself. I told her that was fair, that habits don't break on a single conversation schedule, but that I'd keep noticing, and keep saying so, every time, until the new shorthand became the automatic one instead of the old. She didn't get defensive. That, more than anything, was how I knew something had actually shifted and wasn't just performance for my benefit. The old Renata, the one who'd said nothing exciting and it's fine, he likes his routine, would have bristled at being corrected twice in 2 months. This one just said, "You're right. I'll do better." And the next time I heard her describe me to a stranger at a school fundraiser for Etta in November, she got it right without my having to say a word. I'm not going to tell you Preston and I became close in some tidy, cinematic way. We didn't. We became respectful, which is its own kind of close, and maybe the more durable kind. He still calls me Walt, not Dad, and I've never asked him to change that. He earned his way back into full signing authority at Hallcrest after his probation ended, and Desmond Ruiz told me, without my asking, that Preston had become one of the most careful reviewers on his team, the kind of careful that only comes from having once learned, in front of his whole family, exactly what carelessness costs. Grant Wexler's case went through the proper channels, a civil suit for recovered funds, cooperation with a fraud investigation that I stayed entirely out of because that part was never mine to resolve personally, only to report accurately and let the people whose job it was handle it. That's not vigilante justice. That's just letting institutions do what institutions are for. Etta still asks about Sarge every time we talk. Sarge is older now, slower on the stairs, but he still puts his head on my knee every night like he's checking that I'm still there, and I scratch his ears, and I think about how much of my life has been built out of quiet, unwitnessed loyalty. Loretta's, the Army's, Sarge's, and finally, slowly, imperfectly, my daughter's. Last month, Renata drove out to Tulsa again, this time with Etta in the back seat, and the three of us went to Dots together, and Curtis got to meet my granddaughter for the first time and told her a version of the bullpen story so wildly exaggerated that even I lost the thread of it halfway through. Renata laughed until she had to wipe her eyes with a napkin, and watching her laugh like that, easy and unguarded, in the same diner where she'd once apologized to me over burnt coffee, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. That vindication was never really the point. I hadn't wanted my daughter humbled. I hadn't wanted her humiliated the way she'd once, carelessly, humiliated me in front of 40 strangers. I had wanted, simply, to be seen, accurately, without exaggeration in either direction, neither smaller than I was nor suddenly inflated into some tycoon out of a movie. Just seen, the way a father hopes to be seen by the child he raised. That's what I got, in the end. Not an apology tour. Not a reversal so complete it erased what came before it. Just a slow, patient correction. A pie moved to the center of the table, a sentence said accurately at a school fundraiser. A granddaughter who no longer needs to ask if Papa Walt has enough to fix things, because she's watched him fix them, quietly, more than once now, and has simply come to expect it. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the people who love you don't always see you clearly. Not out of cruelty, most of the time, but out of habit, out of assumption, out of never once being asked to look twice. You don't fix that by shouting until they see you. You fix it, if you're lucky, by staying exactly who you are until the truth catches up with the room. If this story meant something to you, or if you've got one like it of your own, a moment when someone finally saw you for who you actually were, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Tell me about it in the comments below.